Closer look at Oreo cookies and a new study tonight that suggests if you can't stop eating them, there's a reason.
It was the idea of Jamie Honahan, who graduated last year. She was a neuroscience major. She was also a PICA scholar. And as we all know, PICA scholars are interested in social justice issues. And Jamie was interested in the obesity epidemic and the correlation with the obesity epidemic and the lack of healthy food choices in urban populations, urban low socioeconomic status populations that they have a higher incidence of obesity but don't have access to healthy foods and oftentimes are limited to high fat, high sugar fast food. Being a neuroscience major, she wanted to explore those issues and knew that I did drug abuse research, so she was interested in exploring the hypothesis that there is such a thing as food addiction, and that high-fat, high-sugar foods can stimulate the brain and create behaviors that are similar to drugs of abuse. The experiment had two parts. The first part was behavioral, and we used a procedure called conditioned place preference, which basically assesses an animal's the strength of an association that an animal develops between the pleasurable feelings of drugs of abuse or anything that's pleasurable and a specific environment. A group of rats that ate Oreos and developed an association with an environment, and we had rats that were given an injection of cocaine or morphine that did the same thing.
Their study concludes at a Connecticut college that they went after the Oreos more than they did the other drugs that were in the lab test.
The conclusions that were drawn in some of the articles seem to be based on an experiment that involved a maze and how rats could choose to either go look for Oreos or go look for the rice cakes, and that was not true. We didn't have a maze, and we gave them a predetermined either rice cake or Oreo.
What we found was that the Oreo conditioned rats had an equally strong conditioning. That is, the pleasure they experienced from eating Oreos was the same as rats that were injected with cocaine or morphine. That's not altogether surprising or novel. Other people have shown that. In fact, we based our study on another study. We extended that with the second part of the study, which when we were finished, we looked at the brains of the animals, and we looked specifically at the pleasure center of the brain. It's called the nucleus accumbens, and we used a procedure called immunohistochemistry to identify or to measure the expression of a protein called CFOS, which is it's basically an indicator of cellular activation. So it can tell us what part of the brain is turned on in response to a specific behavior. And when we did that, we found that the rats that were conditioned to Oreos, they had a higher level of activation in the nucleus accumbens, in the pleasure center, than the animals that were conditioned to cocaine or morphine. That's it. That's basically all we found.
When we say, oh, well, Oreos and cocaine can be associated in the way that they interact in the brain, I was surprised by how quickly that got taken to Oreos are just as addictive as cocaine, and that was a pretty funny reaction.
The biggest issue was that there was too much of a focus on the shock value, and people picking up on the headline that Oreos are more addictive than cocaine. That's not exactly what we found.
What we were trying to find was more the expression of certain proteins related to these substances being consumed and relating that to the obesity epidemic.
So when I see things like the Conan O'Brien skit that sort of minimizes the actual findings of our research, it doesn't sit well with me.
We found to be the most interesting was more of the chemical processes in the brain and the way that the brain reacts to the Oreos compared to how it reacts to the cocaine. Not like it's not your fault that you gained weight, but more like, well, there's certain reasons why you can't control your eating behavior, and maybe like if you have a certain type of personality, like a very addictive personality, then maybe that could be contributing to a weight gain or an excess of eating.
You know, they tried to link this whole thing about how addictive it is, and therefore this may be a big problem for obesity epidemic in America. Give me a break. You know, the obesity epidemic in America is multifactorial. You got lack of exercise, you got portion problems, you got stress, you got economic factors. One cookie ain't the problem.
Obviously, obesity is a multifactorial thing, because if any disease was just had one factor, then we would be able to solve everything that has been happening in the world. I mean, at least getting research in certain parts of it could then in the end put all the research of the different factors together in hopes to actually find cures or treatment.
One thing we were very happy about is that it at least reignited the conversation about the obesity epidemic and the hypothesis that food can be looked at as an addiction. We're happy with that, and we have received some positive feedback from scientists and lay people and others that have thanked us for sort of getting that story out.